mile from here, some 20 metres down, are some amazing archaeological finds. 5 huge iron cannon, 2 anchors, and a great spread of smashed Spanish pottery dating from the late 16th century. It's tempting to think they might be part of a Spanish Armada galleon sunk after the famous naval battle. But if so, how, why and when did they get here to Kinlochbervie, which is right on the northwestern corner of Scotland? Time Team have got just 3 days to dive these treacherous waters and find out. Nearer to Reykjavik than London, Kinlochbervie is now a quiet fishing port on a storm-lashed and inhospitable coastline. The wreck site was originally discovered 3 years ago by the divers of RAF Lossiemouth, led by Corporal Roy Hemming, who found a group of anchors and cannon lying at the bottom of an underwater cliff over 20 metres down. The seabed was covered with broken pottery. More importantly, they found this, an intact Maiolica wine ewer. This highly decorated jug has been dated from the last quarter of the 16th century, the time of the Spanish Armada. In an attempt to prove whether the wreck's one of the fighting ships of Philip II's ill-fated invasion fleet, or perhaps a lost Mediterranean trading vessel, a team of marine archaeologists will be searching the seabed for more accurate dating evidence. As well as more pottery, they'll be looking for small metal finds and personal artefacts. We've been invited here by the Archaeological Diving Unit, the ADU, who are responsible for investigating and excavating the historic shipwrecks around the coastline of Britain. With only a few days to dive on the site, the ADU's team of divers, led by Director Martin Dean, have also enlisted the RAF to help with what's become, due to the unstable conditions on the seabed, a classic case of rescue archaeology.
One of the reasons we're here is to recover pottery which is being damaged by the movement of water during storms. There is archaeological evidence to indicate that every now and then another piece gets broken, another piece gets broken, and through time the whole assemblage would be ground into dust.
So our Time Team visit here is actually really important, because if the pottery is not recovered in time, any information from it will be completely lost.
That's right, we're in a classic situation where we've got to work fast to recover material and information before it disappears.
Before we can set sail for the site, Phil has to meet a new but essential member of the archaeological team.
Good Lord, Graham, that's a big old box you got there. What on earth you got in it?
That's Eric, our pet ROV.
Eric the ROV?
Yes.
What on earth's an ROV?
Remotely operated vehicle.
Oh, it's like a mini submarine then?
Yeah.
What does it do then?
We've got a camera on the front, 2 lights, and propellers at the side and the top. We fly it about and take the pictures underwater.
So you can operate it from on board the ship?
Yeah.
And you can actually see the pictures in a monitor, do you?
Yeah. Whatever Eric sees, we see when we're flying about.
So he's eminently mobile?
Yeah.
He can go down as deep as you like, he can stay down there for virtually forever?
Yeah, as long as you've got power, he'll stay down there.
So safe, you don't actually have to have somebody in the water?
Yeah, you don't get wet at all. At least hopefully you don't.
But I still had to get wet in order to pass a tough refresher course in diving safety here in the harbour. So Phil set off without me. It takes him half an hour to get to the site on board the ADU's specially equipped vessel Scimitar, while the RAF take the speedier option. I always thought I was quite an experienced scuba diver until I came here, but getting used to bulky dry suits, umbilical lines and underwater communication systems was really necessary and hard work. Underwater, it's fine, because you're so buoyant, but as soon as you get back onto the surface, you've got all this flipping weight. When you feel like a fish out of water. Eventually I managed to get out of the water and the harbour in the only transport available, an old trawler. It's hard to understand how we can have an Armada wreck in this part of Scotland, but then again there's lots of things about the great Spanish invasion fleet that aren't what they seem, especially the role played by one of our supposed national heroes, Sir Francis Drake.
Drake played very little part in the Armada campaign. He spent most of it gadding around looking for prizes and feathering his own nest, and left most of the fighting to his fellow commanders, and his role in the Armada campaign was negligible.
The English fleet was commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, and in fact all they did was pursue the Spanish Armada up towards the shoals of the Netherlands, and expended every single shot in the English locker to try and sink it and batter it into submission. And how many did they sink, Felipe?
They sank one ship.
One ship, that's it.
So the Armada wasn't in ruins. The fleet was here. Our shipwreck is right up on the north of Scotland. Is there any way that it could be related to the Armada?
Oh, it surely could be, yeah, because you've got to remember that in naval warfare in the age of sail, everything is determined by the wind. In our historical accounts like those that Robbins implicitly sneered at, there's a lot of hot air, but there isn't enough wind. That's what decides everything in the age of sail. And what happened to the Armada was that it was blown by the wind up the North Sea from the 9th of August onwards.
All the way
so
up here.
up where you're standing, more or less, Corenza, was blown in your direction. That it wasn't your allure that drew them there, it was a following wind which drove them. And on the 13th, that wind began on the 9th, on the 13th it turned into a terrible storm which scattered the English fleet. So much so that people all over Europe thought that the Spaniards must have won a tremendous victory. That wind didn't scatter the Armada. The Armada endured that wind and kept coming. But by that time, they decided they couldn't possibly ever get back to the Channel and start the fight against the English again. So they planned to sail back to Spain through here between the Orkneys and Shetlands, and out here on the standard trade route from Scandinavia to Spain, which would involve coming way out into the Atlantic, so that you avoid any possibility of getting blown onto these rocks by the powerful westerly winds. And you have to come out against the wind, and eventually, when you're quite safe, well past Ireland, you can head towards Spain. And that's what their sailing instructions said. But at that point, this remorselessly bad weather takes an even worse turn, and they are lashed by the tail end of one of those hurricanes which periodically reaches right across the Atlantic towards these islands. And that is when the most laggardly ships are blown way back over the course that they've already struggled through. This is when we find, there's one famous wreck is blown all the way back to the Shetlands, to Fair Isle. There's another famous wreck which reached Mull and actually managed to anchor safely for a while. And it's in that context that you can imagine a ship like ours perhaps being blown back as far as where we are now and being dashed on those rocks out there.
I'm beginning to get an idea of what it must have been like for the Spanish sailors lost and at the mercy of the Atlantic storms. Stu, you've got two big havens here, one there and one there. Why didn't our Spanish galleon find them?
You've got a very detailed modern chart there, Tony, compiled with lots of soundings over a long period of time. You've got to remember in the 16th century, charts were very much in their infancy, and this is the sort of thing that they might have carried at the time. Basically, just the outline of Scotland.
Yes, but you'd have been able to see these bays, assuming that it was alive.
Well, I mean, look out here now, Tony. We've only been out half an hour. Where did we come from? Go on, point us straight to it.
I think it's that one, but I'm not sure.
It's very easy to get lost, isn't it? Yeah. Remember in the 16th century, the fleet had been driven back by the winds. A lot of them were trying to find shelter. We know there are records of some that did beach themselves for shelter. It might have been night, the storms were raging, this might have been covered in fog. All they knew from their charts that there was a big inlet, which is that one right down there. Yeah. Now the possibility is they may have been trying to head to that, and with the westerly wind from behind us, would have been driving them that way. And there are all these rocks out here. These are fairly much uncharted rocks at that period.
So actually it was really between the two harbours that the vessel was wrecked. Situated in a small bay below 100-foot high cliffs, The dive site today is sheltered from an easterly wind. It's like a mill pond. So mooring safely above the site's no problem, and the RAF team, diving on traditional scuba air tanks, waste no time in getting into the water. On board the Scimitar, though, the ADU, as professional divers, are using a surface supply system.
OK, we're ready to fit the helmet.
Their divers are fed a nitrogen-rich gas mixture from tanks on board. Their air supply umbilical also carries a communication system, and more importantly for us, their diving helmet has a video camera attached, so we can see what the diver sees. It takes the divers several minutes to descend the 25 metres to the bottom of the sea cliff, but once down, it's very calm and tranquil. And yet this coastline is lashed every winter by hurricanes and 150-mile-an-hour winds. What I don't understand is, if you're having all this weather, which presumably turns this water into a turmoil, how come down here we've got these most fantastic finds and anchors still in place and cannons still in place? Why aren't they all swept away?
Topographically, we've got a shallow area here that we're sitting on now, and then it just dives away very, very, very steeply.
Like a big step?
Yeah, a big step. It just goes straight down to 30, 40 metres. I think what's happening is we're getting a little bit of shelter from the rock ahead of us, but also the waves are not building up. They're just bypassing this deep bit of water and going straight onto the shelf.
So because there's a step there,
yes,
it's like they're protected in that little triangle there?
I think so, yes. I think that's the only explanation for it. Normally at that depth, even in sheltered waters, it's like every winter someone's gone down with a JCB and re-landscaped the area, whereas my experience down there was just to see stuff there that was still intact after all those years in this environment is really quite extraordinary.
With all the divers in the water, the ROV's launched. Useful for searching the wreck site, Eric also acts as an underwater safety backup. His all-seeing video eye makes sure none of the divers are in trouble. Much like a scheduled site on land, the team's restricted by the terms of the licence for this site. We've got a surface recovery licence, which means the retrieval of small finds from the seabed, which would be lost or damaged by being left there. So Phil's not going to be needing his mattock or shovel.
Oh, that's the ROV picture then. Yeah, that's actually the diver.
Yeah.
Even though he's an experienced amateur diver, Phil needs to get to grips with all this high-tech kit before he can safely dive on the
Roger, that's
site.
not too far from
First,
Data Me,
he's got to get his underwater bearings.
And here you can see the diver's position acoustically being tracked.
Oh, I see how he's moving.
Yeah, he's moving very slowly.
So he's going along and he's picking up finds, and then each one he finds, he puts a number tag so you can actually plot its position.
Okay, he's now going to look at a piece of myolica. Okay, Steve, can you put your helmet light on and look at that myolica?
So that, oh good lord, isn't that it's gorgeous with that blue pattern, blue painting. Oh, that's quite a big, oh, and it's got yellow on it as well.
Yeah, you can see an interlaced pattern.
Interlaced pattern with that yellow, yellow band round it.
Yeah. Okay, Steve, that's great. And if you could search just generally for more diagnostic pieces. You can see that there's a lot of jumble of rocks.
Right.
Very little thin sediment. But it's quite extraordinary that the ceramics are in actually quite good condition. They're broken, but there's not a huge amount of abrasion, so it's difficult to understand because this must be quite a dynamic environment.
The RAF's team of divers, working in strict rotation, have scoured the seabed and have come up with some amazing finds. This round pottery sherd looks like it has a wasp or insect pattern on it. And this thing, whatever it is, seems to have 3 legs. All these finds need to be carefully recorded before being lifted. Their distribution and spread is critical to our understanding of the wreck site.
So it's your turn to get wet then.
Yeah.
But what's the plan for the dive? What you reckon to do?
Well, today I'm hoping to establish some tapes onto the datums that have been fixed already on the seabed, so we can start measuring in the distribution of the pottery that have been tagged by the divers.
Right.
But the surveying of finds underwater is far more complicated than on land.
To start off with, we have to go and attach tapes to datums, which may take up to sort of 5 minutes.
Right.
But once you've got all the tapes in place and you're pulling them tight.
So you're going to. How many divers do you need?
Well, you can do it with one, but that means you have to tie one end of the tape onto a datum.
Right, and then
But
you
if-
go to the next. Then
yeah.
you go to the next datum and tie that tape. Then you swim to
So
the third
it's-
one.
with one diver, it's a lot of swimming up and down.
And so, whereas on land we would take just coordinates from 2 tapes.
Yeah.
Underwater, you're taking measurements from 3 tapes.
That's right, and ideally 4, because the idea is to within those measurements is to derive depth as well. Because it's a 3-dimensional survey with tapes.
I mean, is it likely that we could survey in 5 objects or 20 objects?
In half an hour, 10 to 15 perhaps, once the system's up and running.
And the point is, it is a very slow process.
Oh yes, much slower than on land. And we're constrained by the amount of time we can spend on the seabed, because at these depths, about half an hour is our maximum bottom time.
The RAF are assisting in the surveying with typical military efficiency. They're field testing a sonar dyne acoustic system, which fires a signal from the find to beacons attached to the datum points. These coordinates are recorded and mapped. The underwater map now shows over 50 pottery finds in 3 dimensions, which means they're ready to be brought to the surface. In recent years, over 200 underwater man-hours have been expended in finding the pottery fragments alone. Getting them to the surface will take 4 people 1 whole dive to achieve. I hope it's worth it. The artefacts are carefully carried to the finds tray and placed inside. The entire tray is then sealed before it's raised 25 metres by a rope to the surface. The plan is to lift some of the more diagnostic pieces, pottery that will hopefully enable our experts to accurately date and geographically place our wreck as 16th century and Spanish.
Good God alive. I just hadn't realised just how big the pieces were. Oh my goodness. This is incredibly lavish stuff, isn't it?
That's really top quality.
Incredibly lavish.
Late 16th century material by the look of it. I suspect this stuff has been buried until quite recently, in the last few years, and some change in the seabed deposits have exposed this
And
material.
the edges all the way round, they're rolled as you'd expect with the stuff being washed to and fro on the seabed.
Oh! Oh, look at that. There's an impressed mark on there. The manufacturer's or a merchant's mark impressed in there. Oh, I'm blowed.
Well, is that the sort of thing that is traceable?
I've no idea. This is the first time I've ever held olive jars. I've only ever seen them in archaeological publications before and in photographs. And from memory, I don't recall that sort of thing. I mean, you get it in the Roman period on amphora.
Is this some indication of its, if you like, its rarity? I mean, you've been doing nautical archaeology for a fair number of years, and yet this is the first time you've actually held stuff like this.
Yes,
is that an indication of its rarity?
It is. It's very exotic for UK waters.
End of day 1. It's been an incredibly exhausting day getting to grips with diving in these conditions and the rain tipping down all the time, but you can't really moan in this place, can you? And the finds have been fantastic. And even now, at gone 7 o'clock, this has just come up. This is a galley brick which they would have used to make a stone fire on board the ship, and they would have been heating something in this on it. It's a tripod, and this is the thing that they were heating, some kind of resin, which we'll have to look at in the future. Hopefully plenty more finds tomorrow, and I'll be down there to look for them. Join us after the break. Beginning of day 2, And yesterday we came up with some really fantastic finds. But apparently the weather's on the turn, and by tomorrow conditions could be really horrible. So we've got to do as much as we can today. Still, things are looking good. We got even more finds last night after we finished filming, including this sounding weight, which the Spanish sailors would have used to swing lead under the water so they could work out how deep or shallow they were, which may well have been the last act any Spanish sailor undertook before the galleon finally hit the rocks. That's assuming we can prove it's a Spanish galleon. Yesterday's pottery finds may hold the vital clues.
But it will tip as Duncan, we've got the first finds off the site in here now.
Hurrah.
I haven't seen these yet.
Oh,
wow, look at that. Look at the colours on them. Incredibly bright, aren't they?
Let me get in there.
It's amazing. I mean, you wouldn't think they spent 400 years in the sea, would you? Well, that looks as if it has.
Brilliantly preserved.
Look at that.
Wow. Oh.
Now, what is that? There's all that orange and yellow design there.
Can you see here in orange, we've got a roofscape, possibly...
Oh, it's a building, yes, of course.
Possibly a view of a town or a monastery.
And presumably it was huge.
We've got a fluting here, so we're talking about the rim at least out this far. It is a large vessel.
What's this mark on the rim of this jar here?
That's an oil jar, an olive jar.
For olive oil?
For olive oil, or some of them held pitch, preserved fruit, a variety of substances. This mark is a stamp which would have possibly some equivalent of an excise mark, I suppose. So it either gives you the volume of the contents, so how much it would have held, or it's possibly a maker's mark or a consignment mark, which tells you what's inside.
What date do you think this assemblage is?
It's the crucial question.
Of course.
Let's go through it. There's nothing here. We've essentially got an assemblage of Italian. There's more Italian there. A Mediterranean 16th century is fine.
Right, so they've come from the right part of the world. They're roughly the right sort of date to be part of the Armada.
That's what I'm saying.
The other thing which occurs to me looking at it, I mean, it's such beautiful stuff. Is it the sort of pottery that a warship would have had on it, or is it more like to be a merchant trader?
Well, the Armada was made up of more than just warships. There were supply ships. It was an invasion fleet, not a battle fleet in that sense. So there are two elements that we have to consider. One is that there were ships carrying goods for the consumption of the invading army, and there's also the possibility of a captain of a vessel having sufficient opinion of himself to want to carry reasonable high quality material. So what we really need to do is establish whether we're talking about a cargo or shipboard consumption.
What more do you need to be more certain?
I think we need more pottery.
Well, one thing is certain, there is more of this type of pottery. There are one or two more olive jars, including one intact one, and there is certainly more tableware and a lot more variety of forms of earthenware.
As the pottery is carefully cleaned of 400 years' worth of encrustation and marine growth, we still need to prove whether the Mallorca was the personal property of a wealthy Spanish sea captain, or perhaps the cargo of a Mediterranean trading vessel that coincidentally sank at the same time as the Armada. A piece of twisted lead sheeting has also been recovered. Could it be from our wreck?
That's the only bit of the ship that we've recovered so far, and it was a patch that was used to repair some holes.
Were they able to make running repairs? I mean, they didn't have professional divers in those days, did they?
Every ship had, its own little corps of divers, and if, for example, you were holed below the waterline, as some ships were in combat with the English, that was the English tactic, to aim low and try and sink the enemy's vessels. The divers would go down and they'd nail a bit of lead plate over the opening, and that's why our divers here have come up with that tortured bit of old lead plate that they brought up. If you will allow your imagination to be stimulated by this, you can imagine the ship persevering through all the storms and eventually being washed up here where the vengeful sea crushes it and contorts it and brutalizes it into that horrible twisted shape that the bit of lead has now. I mean, that almost, for me, is the most vivid piece of evidence we've come up with, even more, heart-searing than all the wonderful pottery.
Running repairs, cannonball holes and Spanish divers may be stretching the facts, but the lack of metal finds is a bit of a worry. What pottery is all very well, but where are the basics? The ship's nails, the musket shot, the small metal finds that you'd expect to find. And an Armada ship would have been armed to the teeth. We've got iron guns on the seabed, but where are the bronze cannon that all ships of this period carried?
I've inflated dry suits through there. I also have...
The aim of Phil's first dive is to forget
there.
about the pottery and search for metal. The RAF has ever come well equipped. Their metal detectors should be able to fit into the crevices between the boulders. Our surface recovery licence means that we can't dig for finds, only retrieve from the surface. Phil begins by examining the two anchors and cannon. We can only guess at how and why these huge iron objects have come together in such a strange formation. Hundreds of years' worth of incrustation covers any surface detail on the cannon that may give an accurate clue to its date. The anchors, though less corroded, unfortunately are of a type and size that were used throughout Europe over a period of 300 years. Phil finds no sign of any other metalwork. The detector sweep also ends in failure. One four-man dive used up and precisely 0 metal finds. What is going on here? One answer may be that the wreck broke into several pieces and our site represents just part of the vessel, the rest lying undiscovered somewhere else along this coastline.
After everything they'd been through, the Spanish sailors who were shipwrecked on the British coast deserved a chance of survival, surely, but what happened to them? Do we know?
In many cases, yes. Particularly in Ireland, where most of the ships foundered. They'd struggle up the beach, and what would they face? If they were lucky, a local Irish chieftain that hated the English. But in most cases, they met the English militia, effectively. Some 2,000 soldiers trying to control the entire west coast of Ireland.
A bit thinly spread.
Precisely, considering that there might have been as many as 1,000 souls on board one Spanish ship that went down, the English were terrified that the Spanish would invade and conquer Ireland and deprive them of one of their great possessions. Scotland, though, Scotland's a different case, because in Scotland you've got a neutral country in which there are many people that are friendly to the Spaniards and hostile to the English. So if you struggled ashore on a beach like this, the situation's entirely different.
So what happened to the people who landed somewhere like this?
They got robbed by the locals. They got stripped naked in many cases, but they weren't physically harmed. And usually they were taken in by Catholic gentry and taken care of, and it took ages for these Spaniards finally to make their way back to Spain. We've got records of them gradually trickling in over the following 9 years.
It's finally my turn to get wet, or is that wetter? Katie and I have been asked to try and solve a bit of a mystery.
My friend Jacques.
This is my friend Gilles. On the shallow part of the site, in the Kelp forest, where there's rumour of a lost cannon. You're pretty sure that there's another cannon down here that no one else has identified, aren't you?
Well, we found a cannon about 2 years ago, and I'm not convinced that the one we found this time is the same cannon.
Why not?
Because the last one we found was half buried in the seabed, and this one's clear, standing clear of the seabed on rocks.
And what makes you think that it's around here and not over there somewhere?
Well, this is the area that we were diving at the time, but that was in the winter and there was no kelp, and now it's summer. You can't get through the kelp to search.
So what are we going to do about that?
Well, the plan is to go down and cut our way through the kelp and clear it out of the way and see if we can find it that way.
Ever done any kelp harvesting before?
I've never done any kelp harvesting, but it's the first time for everything.
Should we get kitted up then?
Yeah.
Seaweed in search of a lost cannon sounds like good fun. Little did I know how difficult it would be, the nautical equivalent of mattocking and shoveling. Hacking our way through the kelp expended so much of our energy that we used up most of our air in just 15 minutes. Bagging the kelp to prevent it falling back and covering the site used up the rest, and no sign of the mysterious cannon. We're going to have to resort to a high-tech solution if we want to find this cannon. John, this thing here is actually a magnetometer, isn't it?
That's right.
But it's nothing like the ones that you use on land.
Well, it's actually very similar.
What's the principle?
Well, I mean, we're still looking at magnetic changes, and we're on land. We're looking for things like ditches and pottery kilns and foundations, and they give us sort of smooth anomalies. Here we're looking for cannon, and they'll give us sharp iron spikes, and so that's what we want to detect.
So, what's the difference between the way that John does mag on land and the way that you do it under the water?
Well, the physics are exactly the same. It's just the way in which we deploy the magnetometer itself, the sensing unit. In this case, we have a torpedo-shaped thing which is towed behind the boat.
And you call it a fish?
We call it a fish, yeah.
And it operates out this way, yeah?
That's right. It will fly through the water just like a torpedo.
And you go up and down in the water just like John does on land?
Exactly the same, yeah.
And Henry, whatever can we do with GPS in the middle of the ocean?
What we already have is Mark and his team have got a map of the subsurface, the actual topography down there. They've got a position of the site, and then if we find anything with this, we can bring that into the same mapping. So it's all important just bringing all that data together.
If this mystery cannon really is down here, do you reckon we're going to find it?
Should do, yeah. It should make a big, loud peepee noise, which is what we're after.
Big, loud peepee noise. Listen out for that. Before launching the fish, we've had to get everyone out of the water because we don't want the magnetometer to detect any of the metal carried by our divers.
I mean, basically, this is just looking at the Earth's magnetic field with nothing in it. The sort of seabed, no sort of sign of any iron cannon or anchors.
The problem is we're flying the fish very high because it's shallow water, and we're not sure about what's happening in terms of depth. So we're gradually getting deeper and deeper as we're going off here, which means we're getting further and further away from any cannon that's lying on the seabed.
Endless trawls later, and no peepee noise. An error in our steering of just a couple of metres would have meant we passed close by, but not close enough. So just because we didn't find it doesn't mean it's not there. It's almost the end of the day, and the weather's taken a turn for the worse. The RAF boys are still game, but feels a bit worried about his next underwater excursion.
So Martin, what actually is the purpose of this dive?
Well, there are two things we're going to do. We're going to take you down to the deeper part of the site, down to about 25 metres, and there we're going to recover the one complete pottery vessel that's lying there. It's an olive jar, and we have a specially constructed container on the seabed, placed there by the RAF guys at the shot, and we're going to put the pot in the container, put the container in a lifting basket, and then the RAF guys will gently lift it to the surface.
Brilliant.
How long is that going to take you?
Well, we've got a maximum time of about 28 minutes. We can't go into decompression times because in this weather, with a brisk wind, if the boat starts to move, we have to be in a position to recover divers almost instantaneously.
So you can't stop to sort of decompress on the way up?
That's right.
Of course, on dry land, once a fine's ready to be lifted, it's a sort of 2-minute job to just get it in the fines tray, but underwater it's much more difficult.
Yes, everything underwater is in slow motion, essentially. I mean, it's taking us one whole diving operation to recover one whole pot. I mean, it doesn't compare with the shortness of time on land.
Okay, Martin, it's Carenza. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Carenza.
Okay, so are you down at the olive jar now?
Yes, we're at the olive jar.
I can see it.
Yeah, Phil and I are just looking at it. To our left is a box in which to put it. And I think Phil is about to pick it up and put it in.
Okay, we'll watch you as you do that.
He looks quite happy, doesn't he?
Okay. here, I'll give him a hand, and in it goes. Lovely. It's difficult for me to communicate with Phil. I'm trying to indicate to him to push that down. Yeah, he's doing that. Give an OK sign. And a bit more padding.
The padding's just so it doesn't get knocked around and broken coming up to the surface, yeah?
Yeah. OK, now we'll take these cable ties off. Okay, just put it down here, Phil. Okay, I think Phil wants to head up. Let's have a look at his hair. Okay, Phil and his buddy are going up.
Hello, Diver 1.
Yeah, how much time have I got?
And we have 8 minutes to get you to the first stop, safety stop, 6 metres. Did you copy that, Diver 2?
On his way back up, Martin spots a tagged piece of pottery unlike anything so far recovered.
It's a very unusual piece of pottery. Perhaps an oil lamp.
It's a lamp.
Yeah, it's in the shape of a Dutch clog almost, or the prow of a ship. And this may well be the sort of thing that will indicate where the contents of the ship came from.
That's exactly what we want from Duncan. We're saying he needs diagnostic pieces, try and work out where the ship came from. That's fantastic.
Back on the surface, the intact olive jar looks like it may still contain remnants of its original contents. Only a long period of conservation and analysis will tell. And this find turns out to be far more diagnostic than we could ever hope for. But you'll have to take Martin's oil lamp opinion with a pinch of salt.
It's the end of day 2. We've all been in now. The visibility is fantastic and the finds are getting better and better. But will the weather hold out tomorrow? Keep your fingers crossed for us and join us after the break.
Beginning of day 3, and it looks as though our worst fears are about to be realised. It may look pretty nice out there now, but the weather forecast says heavy rain and 30-knot winds. We've already sent our professional divers out there. Let's hope they can do some work before the weather starts to break, because every new find seems to be even higher status than the last. Unfortunately, the sea conditions are far too severe for safe diving, and the RAF reluctantly return. I know you've all been in and out of the water non-stop for the last few days, but at last, here's a chance for you to see what we've actually pulled out. What do you reckon on this lot?
I'm astounded. This is the best collection of Italian Renaissance pottery excavated from an archaeological context in this country. I think I can say that now. It's astonishing. We've got a full range of Italian tin glazed pottery here, maiolica it's called generally.
When you say Italian, is it the sort of stuff that a Spanish nobleman might carry?
Oh yes, certainly. This material here especially was favoured by the Spanish nobility.
What about this?
Yeah, that's the piece we were looking at yesterday. It's been cleaned up even more, and Raysan's working on his reconstruction. Those colours are actually quite diagnostic. They're a clue as to the origins of the piece. It's a Montelupo Crespina.
What's that?
A bowl, a fluted bowl made in imitation of silver plate at a place called Montelupo, east of Florence. The parallel I've found for this piece has been dated 1575.
When was the Spanish Armada, anyone?
1588.
Oh, thank you.
But here, this is really the creme de la creme. This is the best collection of this material ever excavated in this country. And it represents high status. We're talking dukes and princes, luxury tableware, made to order by a family based in Urbino on the eastern side of Italy, called the Patanazzi family.
And who would they have been making this kind of stuff for?
Well, this is a star piece. This is a salt cellar. It's boat-shaped, so the same at both ends, with the salt held in the dish in the middle. and would have been a centrepiece of the table. The parallel I found for this piece was made by the Patanazzi family for a service presented at the wedding of the Duke of Ferrara.
Why would an invading army be carrying a dinner set?
Well, it may be an indication of the confidence of the Spanish nobility in their success, and perhaps they were intending to use it for a damn good meal when they got to the other end.
Martin, did all this stuff come from one small area?
Yes, it did. It comes from about 4 square metres of the seabed.
And is there likely to be more down there still?
Undoubtedly, because the nature of the seabed is such that small pieces could be tucked under rocks and in crevices.
So is this an area that you're going to target as a priority for this afternoon? If the weather holds out, of course. We decide to have one last attempt at diving the site in extremely marginal weather conditions, a westerly gale. Knowing that all the pottery collected so far is dated before 1588 tips the balance in favour of this being an Armada wreck. But if we can collect more pottery, giving us a bigger sample for analysis, this must mean more accurate dating. And if that dating is still prior to 1588, then we can be confident that this is a lost Armada ship.
If this is an Armada vessel, it would have got here during a period of very strong, very heavy westerly winds, and probably, you know, after the Armada had been lashed by the tail end of an Atlantic hurricane.
I mean, one thing I'm quite keen to establish, whatever period the vessel belongs to, is if anybody survived the wreck and may have established themselves as a small community, settlement shelters on this headland here. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to do, is actually go and look along here and see what the topography is like, if just that very remote chance that somebody did make it ashore.
Stuart's plan is to trek from Kinlochbervie to the cliffs above the wreck site in search of 16th century archaeology. 3 kilometres as the crow flies, but nearer 10 when you take into account the mountainous terrain. With a shortage of willing volunteers, Stuart press-gangs our unit manager Jamie into coming with him.
I tell you what, he's a hard character to keep up with, this Stuart. I don't know how to set some pace.
I feel like a trussed-up chicken in this life jacket. I've just landed in a lock about 2 kilometres away from the wreck, because we can't land the sea states too rough. But it's been a good place to start, because immediately we've come across the remains of a small farmstead, effectively. It's ruined now, but there are at least 2-3 buildings here. This is typical of the sort of farmsteads that were likely to be here in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. They're difficult to date, but there's no reason something like this might not have been a small family farm at the time of the Armada wreck. Onwards and upwards.
If that is a vessel from the Armada, is there any way of us working out which one it is?
If it's an Armada vessel, it's got to be one of the laggardly, wobbly ones which couldn't make much headway and was easily blown back by the terrific storm. It's got to be, on the basis of what the divers have found so far, it looks as if it's probably a relatively modest ship and one which is very lightly armed. And there is a ship that we don't yet know the whereabouts, final whereabouts of, which fits the bill. It was the San Gabriel, and it was a supply vessel, maybe a horse carrier. And if our ship is an Armada ship, although I don't want to allow my imagination to run away with me, and a historian's imagination has to be disciplined by respect to the evidence and respect to the sources. We don't yet have enough evidence to be certain about this at all, but I'd be prepared to wager a small stake at the moment that it might be the San Gabriel.
Laggardly and wobbly. Out on site, the first priority is to get the team safely into the water. The dive plan is to find, tag, bag, record, then lift as much highly decorated and patterned pieces of pottery as they can. But the weather seems to be worsening. Stuart's search for any traces of wreck survivors has petered out. Up here, there are no signs of human habitation.
Well, come about another kilometre over the hills. I can see a loch, I can see the sea, and this is one of the lochs they might have hopefully tried to get a longboat into to get some provisions. And down below me here have a freshwater stream, so this is the sort of thing that would have been very appealing after months at sea, to get some fresh water, replenish and then carry on the journey. So We'll go and look, see if there's any evidence of anything around here.
At 26 metres, the effects of the storm are still apparent. The visibility is poor. The sand and the weed from the seabed are now flying around everywhere, making the location of new finds very difficult. Katie's managed to find a new piece of pot, but it's difficult for her to see if it's patterned. Divers are working as fast as they can, but the swell of the storm, even at this depth, is starting to affect the stability and safety of the dive. Reluctantly, the team cut short what they know is their final dive on the site this year. Disappointed, they return to the surface, with little to show for such a dangerous and exhausting exercise. Stuart's now trekked almost 10 kilometres from Kinlochbervie to the cliffs above the wreck site.
Well, finally got here. It's pretty easy to see how anybody who was shipwrecked down here would have found it incredibly difficult to get up these cliffs. You can also see just how tortuous those rocks out there, and they could have easily brought a ship to its demise on these rocks. It's starting to feel a bit desolate out here now. The weather's closing in, the boats have gone, you can see the buoys where the wreck is. A feeling of sort of some sadness that potentially quite a few hundred people might have drowned down there, but that's history and that's the Armada. I think I'm going to find my way back now.
The weather's finally beaten us all, just as it did the wreck that still lies in the relative tranquility below the treacherous rocks of Kinlochbervie. It's been a real struggle working in such a hostile environment and being constrained by the limited working time at these depths. But the evidence we've managed to accumulate does point to an Armada wreck, and quite possibly the San Gabriel. Who knows if all these boulders were to be moved away in a major marine excavation, what might still be down here. After 3 days and an incredible amount of work from the RAF and the ADU, it does seem as though our shipwreck was part of the Great Armada. But what we could never have expected was the treasure trove of Renaissance pottery, which was possibly owned by some Spanish prince or duke convinced of victory and the conquest of England, but which it seems ended for him and his men with death, smashed on the rocks and cliffs of the Scottish coastline.